Fire licked at the hull and vicious explosions shook the ship in the sea, with hundreds of scared passengers clambering to lifeboats or to the sea. Flames destroyed the once beautiful vessel, and when the smoke cleared, devastation was left in its wake. But what became of this once great ocean liner? Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Lakonia would begin her life cycle as Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, built by Nederlandse Scheepsbouwmaatschappij in Amsterdam as yard number 194, and she was the 89th ship built for the Netherlands line. She was built alongside her sister ship, Marnix van Saint Aldegonde, which was launched in December of 1929 and completed in September of 1930. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was launched on August 3, 1929 and completed on March 13, 1930 after fitting out. Both ships were built for the Netherlands line services between Amsterdam and the Dutch East Indies. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was named after a Dutch soldier and statesman of the same name who was beheaded in 1619. Before we get much further into her story, let's look at her specs. As Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the ocean liner first had a black hull, then later she had a pale gray hull with red keel, white superstructure, and two yellow and black funnels toward the bow of the ship. She was incredibly striking, and later on as Lakonia, her hull and superstructure were both white with a red keel, and her two funnels were powder blue with black tips, so still incredibly beautiful. Her tonnage sat right at 19,040 gross registered tons, and she spanned 4 decks. She was 586.2 feet long, had a beam of 74.8 feet wide, and a depth of 36.1 feet deep. As built, her passenger capacity was originally split into 4 classes. She could carry 366 first class, 280 second class, 64 third class, and 60 fourth class passengers for a grand total of 770. She could carry 9,000 tons of cargo and had berths for 360 crew. Up until 1933, her code letters were PGHB, though in 1934 they were superseded by the maritime call sign PFEB, and up until 1939 she was registered in Amsterdam. Now, let's look at propulsion. She was a motor ship with 2 Sulzer Marine diesel engines driving her 2 propellers. Between them, these engines developed 1,555 nominal horsepower, turning 2 screws, and gave her a cruising speed of 19 knots. At her launch, the ship was the largest built in the Netherlands. The artist Karel Adolf Lyon-Cachet and sculptor Lambert de Ziel decorated her interior with teak, marble, and many statues, mosaics, tapestries, and chandeliers, giving her an air of luxury. She had an unremarkable service from her launch until 1939, when World War II would break out. She was a beautiful ship, but even the most beautiful people experience pain. Do you find yourself sitting on a chunky wallet in your back pocket causing hip and back pain? And ladies, is your wallet so fat you have to have a purse for it? Well, look no further. Ridge wallets are flat and sleek so they can fit in your front pocket, protecting your posture and saving you from back pain. Not only this, but they are made from incredibly strong carbon steel and come in a variety of gorgeous colors, including your favorite NFL football team's livery and customization options. Not only this, but Ridge wallets have RFID blocking technology to prevent electronic pickpocketing and credit card theft. My husband is so jealous of my Ridge wallet, he's begging for one for Christmas. If you want to hold your cards and cash in style like me, check the cards of this video to visit Ridge and use my code YouTube10 at checkout to receive a 10% discount on your order and help support my channel. Thank you so much, Ridge. And now it's time to move into World War II. When World War II broke out following Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, Holland America Line chartered Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, re-registered the ship in Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, and used her as a cargo ship between Batavia and New York City. This wouldn't last long, however, as she was requisitioned for wartime service on January 20th, 1941 to serve as an Allied troop ship, and she was converted by Harland and Wolff to carry up to 4,000 troops. Orient Line managed her at this point. In 1943, she was re-registered again, this time in Willemstad, Curaçao. After servicing India, Singapore, and Penang, she finally returned to her home port of Amsterdam on February 13, 1946. Her sister ship, Marnix van St. Aldegonde, had also served as a troop ship in World War II, though unfortunately, she did not come back out of the war. German aircraft sank her by torpedo off the Algerian coast, but all 3,000 troops and crew were saved by rescue ships, thankfully. After World War II ended, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was released from wartime service. Netherland Line had her refitted, and in 1946, she returned to her usual service on the Amsterdam to Batavia route. From 1945 until 1949, Indonesians fought for their independence from the Netherlands during the Indonesian National Revolution, and this would result in their independence. As an American, a war for independence always gets me fired up. For several years during this conflict, the ship ferried Dutch troops returning home from Indonesia. By 1950, Indonesia was finally independent, and the ship was withdrawn from the East Indies service. She was transferred to the Amsterdam to Australia service instead, and began her first Australian voyage on September 2, 1950. She serviced Australia and New Zealand for the next 12 and a half years, with occasional service to Canada and the United States. Her Australian service was a smash hit, and in 1951, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was put into dry dock in Amsterdam for refitting. She was refitted as a one-class ship with berths for 1,414 passengers. Her lounges were restored to their original state, and additional passenger facilities were installed. 8 lifeboats were added, bringing her total number of lifeboats up to 24. On January 23, 1952, she left for Australia but was forced to return to Amsterdam after 4 small fires were discovered aboard. The fires were quickly extinguished, and though arson was suspected, no suspects were ever arrested. In 1958, she underwent yet another refit, and this time her passenger berths were reduced to 1,210. The Amsterdam Dry Dock Company completed this refit in 3 months for a cost of 800,000 Australian dollars. During this refit, 3 luxury suites were added, as well as a cinema, gift shop, nightclub, promenade lounge, and second swimming pool. All public rooms were refinished and restored. Her main mast was moved to atop the bridge, and her decks were extended aft. Her funnels were raised, giving rounded tops and painted yellow and black. Her black hull was repainted gray, like we mentioned earlier. On April 2, 1959, she was reassigned to her new port, Southampton, England, and she offered round-the-world service, making stops in Australia, New Zealand, Bermuda, and New York City. She was now debuting as a cruise ship instead of her typical ocean liner fashion. She left on her last round-the-world voyage for the Netherland Line on June 30, 1962, and she arrived in Sydney, Australia on February 3, 1963, being decommissioned by the Netherland Lines that day, ending her 33-year career for them. She then set sail for Genoa, Italy, and she arrived there on March 7, 1963. She wouldn't stay long, however. And this break won't be long either. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Let's look at her time as TSMS Lakonia and her final voyage. On March 8, 1963, one day after arriving in Genoa, the beautiful ship was purchased by a Greek company, the Shipping Investment Corporation. She'd undergo yet another refit, with her decks and public rooms being renamed and the aft swimming pool being enlarged. 12 extra cabins were added, and air conditioning was installed throughout the ship. Her hull was then painted white to match the superstructure, and her funnels were painted light powder blue with black tips. Her tonnage was increased to 20,314 gross registered tons, and she was re-registered to Greece as TSMS Lakonia, and she would serve for the Ormos Shipping Company. Ormos Shipping Company, or the Greek Line, had Lakonia offering cruises from Southampton to the Canary Islands. She left Southampton as Lakonia for the first time on April 24, 1963. She proved to be incredibly popular, and the Greek Line gave her the thumbs up, planning 27 cruises for 1964. Before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's quickly frame where we are in history. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy would be assassinated, and his Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson would take over as President of the United States. In 1964, the Beatles made their American debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, and racial segregation was ended via the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1968, both the civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated. In 1969, President Richard M. Nixon was elected, U.S. astronauts would land on the moon for the very first time, Woodstock's enormous music festival revolutionized concert going for the future, and the first draft lottery for the Vietnam War was held. The 60s was a tumultuous time that saw a lot of change, and this was the time period that Lakonia was smack dab in the middle of. From December 9th through the 13th of 1963, she underwent yet another minor refit, adding a new pneumatic fuel injection system, and cabins were redecorated, as well as the kitchen and pantry being completely remodeled. She was fitted with a number of safety features we need to note before we get into the disaster. She carried 24 lifeboats capable of holding 1,455 people, so more than her passenger capacity, and she had an automatic fire alarm system and 2 fire stations with specialist firefighting equipment. She had life jackets for everyone on board and an extra 400 stowed on deck for good measure. Theoretically, she should have been an incredibly safe ship, but as we know, you can't prepare for everything. It was Christmas time, and Lakonia was gearing up for a Christmas cruise of the Canary Islands in December of 1963. She left Southampton on December 19, 1963, with 646 passengers and 376 crew aboard for a total of 1,022 people aboard, all but 21 being British citizens. Her captain was 53-year-old Matthew Zarbis. Her first scheduled stop was to be the island of Madeira. The crew had conducted a boat drill a week before, and the ship passed a safety inspection by the British Ministry of Transport just 24 hours prior to setting off from Southampton. She had a Greek certificate of seaworthiness, and passengers took part in a lifeboat drill on December 20th, but one passenger noted that it was only for his lifeboat station, so that would not be sufficient by today's standards. Everything seemed to be going fine until the late night hours of December 22nd. At 11 p.m., a steward noticed thick smoke seeping under the door of the ship's hairdressing salon. Concerned, he opened the door to find the room completely ablaze, and the fire rushed into the hallway toward the cabins. He and another steward tried to fight the fire with fire extinguishers, but it was spreading too quickly for 2 men to contain. One of them ran quickly to notify the ship's purser, Antonio Boghetti. Fire alarms started to go off, but they were so quiet they were not heard by most passengers. I myself have hearing issues, so I certainly wouldn't have heard it. One survivor later told reporters, quote, "The fire alarm bell was so weak that it sounded like someone calling the waiter to ask for tea. An alarm did go off on the bridge, and this was loud and clear, displaying the fire's location. The ship was about 200 miles north of Madeira at 35 degrees 15 minutes north, 15 degrees 15 minutes west." While all of this was happening, most of Lakonia's passengers were in the ship's ballroom, called the Lakonia Room at this point, and they were dancing at the Tropic Tramps Ball. Passengers began to notice the smell of smoke, but it was still legal to smoke indoors at this point, and they brushed it off as extra strong cigar smoke. Captain Zarbis, who had been notified of the fire, tried to make an announcement on the ship's public address system. However, the fire had disabled it. He was trying to do the right thing, however, he was unable. Smoke billowed into the ballroom, alarming passengers, and the band stopped playing. Cruise director George Herbert ushered the frightened passengers to the boat deck, and the upper deck was on fire within 10 minutes. A cruise director, for those unaware, is a high-ranking or senior officer of a cruise ship with responsibility for all onboard hospitality, entertainment, and social events, and acts as the public face of the company on the ship. Unfortunately, many of the passengers who'd been asleep in their cabins found themselves trapped and unable to escape the fire, with flames licking at the doors of their cabins and smoke billowing in. Some passengers were told to go to the main dining room to await further instructions, but most of them ignored this order since it was directly in the path of the fire. At 11:30 p.m., Antonios Kalogridis, the ship's chief radio officer, sent out the first distress call. Quote, "Fire spreading up. Prepare evacuation on ship." At midnight, a second distress call went out. Quote, "We are leaving the ship. Please immediately give us assistance. Please help us." Kalogridis sent out the last call at 12:22 a.m., just before the radio room caught fire. Quote, "SOS from Lakonia, last time. I cannot stay anymore in the radio station. We are leaving the ship. Please, immediate assistance. Please help." A 6-man fire crew tried to fight the fire, but it spread too quickly to be contained. Boilers started to explode, filling the rooms and hallways with thick black smoke, and the suffocating passengers were forced up on deck with the flames. Just before 1 a.m., the ship's purser gave the abandoned ship order. Dazed passengers made their way to the lifeboats, some in their pajamas and rubbing sleep from their eyes, and others still clad in their jewelry and evening attire, dressed to the nines. A few crew members went below decks to rescue passengers from their burning cabins, and the ship's swimming pool attendant and a steward lowered themselves over the side of the ship by rope, pulling trapped people up from the portholes. Evacuation was very complicated, as some of the lifeboats were burned before they could be lowered. 2 of the lifeboats were swamped, spilling their occupants out into the sea. One when it was lowered only by one end, and the other when its davits broke off. Chains had rusted in many of the davits, making the boats difficult or impossible to launch. Only just over half the lifeboats made it safely away from Lakonia, and some of them were less than half full. Several people who dove overboard struck the ship on the way down, killing them before they ever hit the water. Though so far the crew has been pretty heroic, it wasn't entirely that way, according to survivors. Passengers were outraged when the chief radio officer, Antonios Kalogridis, a nurse, and 2 musicians rowed off in a lifeboat. Kalogridis later testified he'd done so apparently to rescue people from the water. He alleged that he did not return to the ship because the current pushed the lifeboat away from it. Passengers also stated that crewmen took advantage of the chaos in order to loot abandoned staterooms. When all of the boats were away, there were still people in the water and over 100 people left on board the burning Lakonia. She continued to burn fiercely, and explosions rocked the ship, making it unstable. Those who remained aboard flocked to the glass-enclosed Agora shopping center at the stern of the ship, and after several hours, the flames closed in on them, and they were forced to descend ropes and rope ladders into the ocean. The port and starboard gangways were lowered as well, and people walked single file down the gangways into the sea. 4 long hours after the first distress call at 3:30 a.m. on December 23rd, the 495-foot Argentine passenger ship Salta arrived on the scene. Salta, commanded by Captain José Barrere, had been on her way from Genoa, Italy to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Half an hour later at 4 a.m., the 440-foot British cargo ship Montcalm arrived. The majority of survivors were taken aboard these 2 ships, and Salta rescued 475 people and took aboard most of Laconia's lifeboats. In the hours that followed, the Belgian paqueboat Charlesville, the American freighter Rio Grande, the British ship Strathallan, and the Panamanian freighter Medi all arrived to aid in the rescue operations. Each rescue ship launched lifeboats to pluck survivors from the water. The United States Air Force sent 4 C-54 aircraft from the Lajes field in the Azores, and the planes dropped flares, life jackets, life rafts, and survival kits to people in the water. An RAF Avro Shackleton from Gibraltar crisscrossed the area, pinpointing boats and survivors and leading rescuers to them. The rescue was hindered by the fact that Lakonia drifted for several miles during the evacuation. People in the water were dispersed over a 2 to 3 mile area. Also, rescue ships were hesitant to near Lakonia because of the risk that her 500 tons of fuel oil could explode. Charlesville sent a lifeboat shortly after daybreak to rescue Captain Zarbus, who was spotted pacing the decks of his still-burning ship. As any good captain should be, he was the last living person to leave Lakonia. Most survivors were taken to Madeira, though others, including Captain Zarbus, were taken to Casablanca, Morocco. In total, the fire killed 128 people, 95 of which were passengers and 33 were crew. Only 53 people were killed in the actual fire, and the rest died from exposure, drowning, and injuries sustained while diving overboard. Most of the dead were buried in a Gibraltar cemetery following an autopsy, which was carried out in a cavern workshop of 1st Fortress Squadron Royal Engineers. Rest in peace to all of those lost in this horrifying disaster. One passenger who jumped from the ship cut her throat on her life jacket. She was rescued by Montcalm, and her injuries were treated by another passenger, Alan Lee. Largely because of this one incident, cruise ship passengers are now instructed on how to hold their life jackets in the event they jump from a height. Crewmen from the Royal Navy aircraft carrier HMS Centaur boarded Lakonia on December 24th, once the fire had died down. Most of the bodies were recovered by the crew of Centaur. By this time, Lakonia was a charred, smoking hulk, a far cry from the elegant ocean liner she once was. Her superstructure had partially collapsed in midships, and the bridge and aft decks had caved in. There were holes blasted near her bow from explosions, and she was listing 10 degrees to starboard. At 5:30 p.m. on December 24th, Christmas Eve, the Norwegian tugboat Hercules secured a tow line to Lakonia. Hercules, alongside the Portuguese tugboat Praia da Draga and 2 other tugs, set off for the British base at Gibraltar, with Lakonia dragging behind. Her list exacerbated each day, and at about 2 p.m. on December 29th, Lakonia rolled onto her starboard side. She sank stern first in just 3 short minutes. The ship went down 230 nautical miles south of Lisbon, Portugal, 250 nautical miles west of Gibraltar. The only color photos taken of the Lakonia disaster ran in Life magazine on January 3, 1964. Life's photographic coverage of the event marked only the second time in history that a publication was able to offer hour-by-hour photographic coverage of a disaster at sea, and the first of which was on August 6, 1956, when Life ran a series of photos on the Italian liner Andrea Doria sinking. The only person known to have taken photos aboard the ship during the fire was Ian Harris from Finchley, London, and he was traveling with his wife Rita at the time. These photos also appeared in Life edition dated January 3, 1964. Rita Harris was interviewed and recounted her experiences on July 2, 1964 on Woman's Hour on the BBC Light program. Survivors include British educator Sir Ivor Jennings with his wife and daughter, architect Owen Luder and his wife Doris, and Henry Wilson, Baron Wilson of Langside. As for the investigation, the Greek Merchant Marine Ministry conducted a 2-year investigation into the Lakonia disaster. The Board of Inquiry maintained that Lakonia should not have passed safety inspections before sailing. Lifeboat davits were entirely rusted and lockers containing life-saving equipment failed to open. The drain holes in many of the lifeboats lacked stoppers, so that passengers had to constantly bail water to stay afloat. Though the crew had conducted a lifeboat drill a week before the voyage, only 5 lifeboats had been lowered. The board argued that all of the lifeboats should have been tested. Charges of looting were dropped after extensive questioning. The crew maintained they had only broken into cabins searching for life jackets. However, the Board of Inquiry made a number of other charges. First, the order to abandon ship was given too late. Second, the operations on deck were not supervised by responsible officers. Third, the crew, except for a few acts of self-sacrifice, failed to rescue sleeping passengers from their cabins below decks. 8 of Lakonia's officers were charged with negligence. Captain Zarbis, his first officer, and the ship's security officer were all charged with gross negligence. The other 5 men were charged with simple negligence. The cause of the fire was ultimately found to be a short circuit of faulty electrical wiring. Rest in peace to all of those lost in this tragedy, as they were humans like the rest of us with families and friends, and who spent their last moments in pain and fear. The sinking of Lakonia ended the lives of 128 and traumatized countless others. Maritime disasters have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives over the course of history, including thousands in World War I. The loss of HMT Aragon in 1917 resulted in the deaths of hundreds of British sailors, and we'll get more into her story next week in the next episode of Shipwreck Sunday.